All right, hello and welcome everybody to a special edition of the Saturdays Are for the Byzantines podcast. I'm going by Tom today because that's my actual name. And here I'm also joined by two friends. We've got Andrew. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello, everyone.
And Stephen.
How we doing?
And Andrew and Stephen are of they've also got a startup podcast here. They're of the American Redemption podcast. Do you guys want to give like a little, overview of what you guys talk about on your show?
Yeah, so we like to frame it as like a culture, kind of Christian Catholic culture podcast for people who are sick of politics, but like want to do things that will help the state of this country, mainly cultural. So we talk a lot about things that you and I can do to improve the state of the country and of our own lives and of our families and our communities. So we've had a lot of guests on to talk about stuff like that. Stephen, how would you frame it?
Yeah, I would say it's putting a new spin on quote unquote culture war issues. I would say that, we're not trying to give you the information in a news format like you would get with some different sources like the Daily Wire or something like that, or any of the other, I guess, what people would call the traditional like conservative leaning media. We it's kind of just open dialogue and talking about what we see in our day-to-day lives and having just different voices and opinions on of people who are trying to better themselves.
Yeah, so that brings us to the topic for today, which is education. Since Tom is very interested in this field, he is a teacher. We thought this would be a great topic to talk about what the purpose of education is, how it's been twisted, what we can do to try to fix this. This is a big problem that's going to take a long time to fix, but it's very important. I don't know if anything other than culture has had a bigger effect on the minds of the youth than education, and we've totally lost that institution on all levels.
One thing I'll say just for clarification purpose on that is because I have a decent amount of viewers who are overseas. This conversation is going to be focused specifically on the American education system. So I know I have some viewers who are like from Europe. I don't know enough about the European education system to comment much on that. Although I have a feeling there'll probably be some similarities, but there's also going to be plenty of differences as well.
Yeah, particularly at the university level, I think there'll be a lot of similarities.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's get into it. Let's talk about the purpose of education. Why are we spending all this time and money sending young people to schools? And if we go far enough back, the idea was we're doing this to create good citizens. But what's key is you need to consider the frame of reference. So if it's the government trying to create good citizens, then depending on which group, what the like ruling class, the regime, what they think is good, and what values they have, they're going to put those on the students. So when we have a government like we do today that's corrupt and broken, and they have awful values, they're instilling those awful values on our citizens, our young people.
Right, exactly. I will say as well, something I always like to frame when you talk about specifically liberal education, because that in forming good citizens, that's like the primary tool you would use there is a liberal education, right? A STEM education is not exactly going to create you good citizens. Might create you good, engineers and mathematicians, but that's not much of a civic education. So in terms of a liberal education, the real point is, that the word liberal, you're liberating yourself. But what are you liberating yourself from? The point of a liberal education is to liberate yourself from the vices, right? In a Catholic context, you think of like the 7 deadly sins, which is actually better described as the 7 deadly vices, because a sin is more of like an individual action. A vice is more of a repeated, like a bad habit you get into. So like a bad habit of pride, or a bad habit of gluttony or whatever. You eat a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts every day. Much as I would like to do that, I shouldn't do that, right?
Right.
And so the liberal education is supposed to liberate you from those vices so that they're not dragging you down anymore, and you can go live a virtuous life, right?
And
An
this
obvious
understanding
example.
of sorry,
Oh,
this
sorry, go ahead.
understanding of liberal education, this precedes the Enlightenment understanding of liberal, right? This goes back to the scholasticism of like the Middle Ages.
Oh, it goes back to the ancient Greeks.
Okay,
Goes back to Aristotle. Good old Uncle Aristotle talked about.
a lot goes back to him.
He a lot of what Aristotle would talk about how there's like a mean between two extremes, and that
Right.
was virtue, right? So you had like vices that went too far in the like high level extreme and the low level extreme. So
Right.
like with pride, you would have on one hand you would have someone who's overly prideful, someone who's like arrogant,
Mm-hmm.
but then you could have someone who's like had no pride at all. This was called like pusillanimity, or like small souledness, basically. And I guess the mean between those two extremes, the virtue would be magnanimity, or like the great souled
Right. Right. The golden
individual.
mean. Yeah. So if like courage is the golden mean between cowardice and rashness.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah, and so that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Aristotle, especially. And then that comes to us through the years. Obviously, Aquinas was a big. Uh, he was kind of an Aristotle fanboy. If you read the Summa, he refers to Aristotle just as the philosopher. Like he doesn't even have a name. He's just the philosopher. I was like tell kids like in a joke like Aquinas had a big man crush on Aristotle.
Can't blame the guy. So let's see. So yeah, good education. We should be. It should create a common culture, a common narrative. It would establish like a an understanding of history that would create citizens who are patriotic. If it's properly understood, they would be instilled with values that they would carry forward for the rest of their lives, and they would think about these values when voting. So these values in America used to be things like family values and upholding traditional American values like liberty and tradition, things like that. But today it's been totally twisted, and the values that students come away with, especially if they have a very ideological teacher, they're coming away with equality and diversity and inclusion. These are their new values now that the public schools are pushing on them.
It's that
And you can speak to that
they,
better than most. Do you work with teachers who are pushing like totally backwards values on their students?
Like every single one.
Wow.
I'm like, especially like the two other conservative guys at the school where I work, which I will not disclose. One of the one other guy who was kind of conservative, he's now he left. He's at a different school, and the other guy is now like our director of operations. Like every other teacher has a pride flag in their room. It's crazy.
That's bad. Wow. That's real bad.
I can't believe it. It's really gotten to the levels that it is. I remember like 10 years ago we were having debates about what flags could be hung and where and stuff like that, and it really seems like we've lost the plot a little bit because so much ground, like Andrew said, has been ceded. It's really a struggle. I really see parallel institutions becoming necessary just for the survival of our cause.
Yeah, I mean they're going to have to. When you get to
Yeah,
a
they
point where
are.
like payment processors won't do service with you based on your political leanings, I mean, you have no other choice.
Yeah, and but it's tough with education because while there are alternatives, there's a couple good private schools and there's homeschooling. Most people are just going to send their kids to public school no matter what. And if we completely abandon that, then we are just handing over like 80% of the population to the regime's will, basically. and it's getting so bad. Like the education system has been this way for a while. Obviously, it didn't happen overnight, but it wasn't nearly as bad when I was in school, and I'm sure you guys would say the same thing. But yet, I still find myself like learning things now and saying, "Wow, they really led us astray in school." Like something you mentioned, Tom, was like the Enlightenment, which I would love to talk more about. You um, have a really good take on that, and I think anyone who went to public school comes away thinking that the Enlightenment was the greatest thing ever, and it saved the West from like the chains of like Christianity, specifically the Catholic Church, and not the case.
Yeah, no, I mean, even if you have, like, let's say, a conservative civics teacher at your high school, you're still gonna hear, all these wonderful things about the Enlightenment and how John Locke was the best thing since sliced bread and all this X, Y, Z, because the idea, right? So the idea, especially with the name, even Enlightenment. So what were things before? Dark, right? This goes back to the old, like, misnomer of the Dark Ages, which any serious historian has basically stopped using
Yeah,
the term Dark Ages. And it's this idea that you had to divorce European civilization from from faith, and you could just go by reason alone. Well, that yes, we do have reason, and believe it or not, even in backwards Catholic medieval Europe, people understood that humans were rational and that we have an intellect and a will. But if you just have this purely rationalistic mindset, that leads to a lot of bad things. People will often, sometimes you'll hear people say, like, you had, especially during the what would be 19th century, you needed to have this, like, movement towards liberal style government, because the old oppressive kings of Europe, like Franz Joseph and all this, were so bad. And it's like, yeah, Franz Joseph was terrible, and then we got rid of him, and then look what you got: fascism, communism. Those were pretty destructive. So this idea that, oh, you'd get rid of the kings and we have this wonderful liberal order. It's like, well, look what came after that. That was pretty bad. So I don't know. Maybe you could have maintained the old order, or had some sort of, a lot of nations had a hybrid order, where you would have elected governments and then you would also have a ruling monarch. But that's completely fallen by the wayside. Any idea that you should, like, if you were to bring that up in a conversation or in a discussion in a public school setting, like a civics class or history class, your teacher would probably talk you down off that, or at least say that that's like not an acceptable viewpoint. And it's this idea that, like I said, the Enlightenment, like, that's where we broke off from, again, like, backwards, irrational, Catholic Church, whatever. Or even if you're looking at it from a Protestant standpoint, just breaking off from a Christian perspective. And it's really not the case. I mean, even if you just think about, for example, like, so let's say you're a person who's more interested in, like, a Republican style of government. Well, okay, fine. Look at the Republic of Venice. The Republic of Venice had been around for centuries before the Enlightenment, and lasted, I believe, 1,000 years. Let me look this up for a second.
yeah. I mean, the idea that republics were a good form of government has been around a long time. Aristotle, Aquinas talked about them. Of the three types of good government: republic, or aristocracy, and monarch. It's always been republic, right there.
Yeah, exactly. You have there's three good and bad forms of rule of one, rule of few, and rule of many.
Yeah.
And yeah. So I just looked at the Republic of Venice lasted 1,100 years, and it
Wow.
started in 697 and fell in 1797. Actually, fell to Napoleon. But yeah, I mean, so that's an example of a republic that existed well before the Enlightenment. And so that's just one example of, even if you do have maybe like a non far left, what people would consider a generally conservative civics teacher, whatever, history teacher, you're still getting this idea that, well, there is a certain point where you have to break off from your tradition, because that the medieval stuff, that was bad, or anything before that was bad. Is really just not the case. I mean, you have to take that Western tradition, like I said, basically all the way back to Aristotle.
Yeah, and I was just thought of another example is the whole Galileo thing. I haven't done enough
Oh,
research.
drastically misunderstood.
Yeah, can you explain that real quick?
Now, I'm no expert on it, but like one thing that people will frequently say is that the church tortured Galileo, and what actually happened was that Galileo, when he came to an agreement with the church, they said that he would go live out in a plush Tuscan estate where he had a vast supply of his favorite wines. And so, if that's torture, then sign me up, man. I'll take it. He lived out the rest of his life on a plush Tuscan estate with just as much wine as he wanted. Like, hey, I love being tortured, right? It's like the old skit of the Spanish Inquisition with the comfy chair. Like, yeah, the Inquisition can put me in the comfy chair all they want.
Yeah, that Galileo sounds like he found the perfect retirement plan.
But the thing about Galileo too was he was a devout Catholic.
Yeah.
And so people act like it's something where you break from Galileo was the enlightened probably atheist guy, and it's like no, he was a Catholic arguing with other Catholics about astronomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't even make the argument that it comes from a non-enlightened. If you want to make the argument that Galileo is the enlightened guy and the church is not, well, Galileo is part of the church, so he's having an argument with his fellow co-religionists.
That's a great way to put it. So what can we do about this? Like most people are not going to switch to homeschool, and then you can't afford private school, so we can't just give up on the public education system. I don't know if infiltration is really a good tactic. Once it's already been infiltrated, it's kind of hard to re-infiltrate it with conservatives. And conservatives just generally aren't as interested in going into that field. I'm not really sure why that is, but that's the case. That's progressive people, more especially women who are more liberal in general, are much more prevalent in the education system.
Yeah, no, they are for sure. And conservatives do a terrible job, right? You'll never hear Ben Shapiro encourage people who are going to college to study English to be a teacher, right? It's always what is it? It's STEM, 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 and more STEM, right? And then conservatives wonder why their teachers are so liberal and why the professors at their kids' school are so liberal. Well, none of you have ever encouraged anybody to actually do something about this. And so I think the first step that you actually can do is if people like us who are interested in these kinds of things, you have to encourage them to go into education. You have to encourage them to go into teaching.
Mm.
And maybe it's like you just kind of, I don't know, you and a couple of other dads take over even if it's like your local Catholic school, because sometimes even, a private school is not going to give you anything that's a whole lot different from the public school other than, better safety for your kid and something like that if you're in a bad area. But there needs to be some sort of concerted, at the very least, community effort to move back into these things.
Yeah, I think a lot of school board positions are a very attainable goal for conservatives.
Yes, for sure.
They have a lot of power, a lot of influence in their schools, and that is one of the good things is that the school system has not been completely federalized. It is still very much different in each county and each state, and we are not beholden to what the federal government says. So there's a lot of room for conservatives to move into school boards and make a difference in their school district.
Yeah, it's still very much localized. I mean, district to district, right? Like, so I work in a large urban district, but if I were to move to a more rural district, I'm not going to see as many pride flags in rooms as I see in the school now. And like I said, with school boards, I mean, especially with the recent election in Virginia I guess last year now. I think a lot of people are now paying attention to this kind of thing. And it used to be, I mean, school boards used to be something like no one really ever paid attention to. Like, no, like I never used to think about who was on the school board in my area or voting for school board. But now, now I'm definitely going to be paying attention to that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a common theme. Localism all the way. We need to be getting into local politics and paying attention to who is running for our local positions. We have a lot more influence, a lot more power, a lot more room to actually change things in our community at the local level.
Right, because I mean that's the level at which you actually experience most political. Well, any sort of politics has more of effect on you at the local level than it does really
Yeah,
at the federal level.
yeah.
Until we got federal vaccine mandates.
Oh boy, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think 2020, 2021, and now into 2022 was the year that people realized that voting nationally, yeah, it's important. You're an American citizen voting in American elections, but your governor with the mask mandates and the vax mandates, all the way down to your city council and then your school board have a more impact.
We met each other, and like 15 minutes later, we both found that we did a podcast. And we're like, let's do a collaboration. But there's a woman at our church, I believe she's in Kentucky, and she's. And I think if you approach education from that perspective, you're going to get a much better. First of all, you're going to get much better citizens, like we said earlier. Right, the point of public education is to create good citizens. And I mean, you could say right now we're creating bad citizens, but from the perspective of the ruling class, they're producing the exact type of citizens they want.
Right.
But if we want to produce the type of citizens that we want, which I think is probably more reflective of most of America outside, like that's not on the coast, then we're going to have to go through some drastic measures to reverse things here. You also need to have pro-family policies as well. You look at what Hungary has done in terms of what they do to support. I mean, I read an article. I worked at a Catholic school last year, so I could read these things. But there was an article in the Catholic Herald just detailing the type of support that Hungary gives families for having like 3 children. And they give you some. I think you end up getting like close to 100,000 euros.
Wow.
Which would come as a shock to everybody in the neighborhood where I grew up. Everybody had 5 kids. Like my family was small; we had 4. Like we would have all been real rich if we were in Hungary now.
Yeah,
But it's not. It's got to go be more than just having a good education policy. It's also got to be having supporting policies where families are supported. Trying to build an economy where, and this is going to be very controversial, having an economy where families can be supported off one income. So you can have one parent who stays at home and raises the children, so you don't have to outsource your parenting.
Absolutely,
because that's another part of how the regime has been able to have so much influence over kids, is because even let's say you can send your kids to the public school or whatever. Maybe you can't afford private schooling. Maybe you don't have the time for homeschooling. But
we talk about this. Be careful that it's not
becomes like can't just accept warm bodies off your vouchers, because what happens is you become financially dependent on those vouchers. And so if you accept a bunch of students who you shouldn't be accepting, then you're not going to want to get rid of them. And it's going to really, and the school where I worked, it really dragged down the level of education to the point where a lot of families pulled their kids out. It was a private school, it was a Catholic school. Parents pulled their kids out and sent them to either public schools or non-denominational private schools, because the quality of education had gone down so much because of the difficulties necessarily
just coming in and bringing in there.
I'd also do this and say another thing like most business jobs don't require a college degree, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm sorry, for sales, I have plenty of relatives who did very well for themselves in sales, didn't go to college, but if you want to get a sales job now, you have to have a BS in business. But I do think it's good to have a public education system, because again, it helps instill, right, especially like Steve, like you were saying, it should be very localized, because then the community can make sure that they're instilling the values they want to have in their children, right? It gets reinforced at home and it gets reinforced at school. And that's how you also create good citizens, right? Because you want to be able to you're passing on the traditions of previous generations onto the new generation, and then they can pass it on to their generation, and that's really the purpose of education. And that primarily should happen at home, but it should also be reinforced at school.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you bring up with the bachelor's degree, and that everyone's going to have a bachelor's degree, because I know that it took me 4 years to graduate with my degree in finance, but I definitely, if you take out all of the general education credits, if you are actually in college at that point to learn a specific skill or trade, I don't know why the 4 year degree has become so.
Because they make more money that way.
That's true. I know why.
No, it's the same. It's the same thing, right? Most degrees, if you take out all the gen ed classes, you can do them in 2 years. I could have done my history degree in 2 years. I'm sure you could have done your finance degree in 2 years.
Yeah, and
if you were just taking like the business finance classes that you needed for that course of study.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big problems we're reaching with the education system is it's just follow the money. You were talking about the same thing with the voucher system, that they can become exactly like the public schools that they're trying not to be, because then they become beholden to the voucher system, just like the public school system is beholden to the tax dollars. And again, you're paying those tax dollars whether you enroll your children in the school or you don't enroll your children in the school, or if you don't even have children. So.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. I'm glad you guys brought up the university system, because that is the root problem here. Even if we can fix the public education system, if we're sending a bunch of teachers who are educated at these Marxist institutions, it's not going to do us much good. And this all goes back to like the Frankfurt School and the cultural hegemony. The leftists realized 100 years ago that if they put a bunch of Marxists in the universities and they were educating generation upon generation, that they would eventually take a foothold in the culture. And we're seeing the fruits of that now. And that's a real huge problem. I don't know what we do about that. Because so many people are still going to college. There's been a push to send less people to college, do more trades, to find a better institution, but it's not enough.
Yeah, it is an interesting debate. I mean, I have, my father was a college professor, so we have a lot of, contacts in academia. And I have asked, some people these questions, like, do you think academia is salvageable? And I've had a number of professors tell me no, they don't think it is. But no, I mean, you're exactly right. What is sometimes called the long march through the institutions. As you said, it started with the Frankfurt School, which was a group of German philosophers and social scientists who were at the Frankfurt School. I believe it was at Frankfurt University in Germany. And they fled during World War II. And so they come to the United States and they bring they're all essentially Marxist philosophers. And they're the guys who started to plant the seeds of what Andrew Breitbart called cultural Marxism, right? Because they come to the United States in the late 1940s, and they realize that no one buys economic Marxism in like Santa Barbara, California, in like 1947, right? Everyone's pretty happy with the state of the economy at that point. Yeah. They can't incite a revolution that way, so they have to do it through more cultural, through race, gender, and those sorts of things. That's the way that they got people riled up, as opposed to economically, because it was very easy to rile up a group of farmers and factory workers who are very poor in a place like Russia. But people who are living in suburban California in 1947, they're pretty content with themselves economically, right? And that's that's really where it all started. And it was the Soviet defector, Yuri. One of you guys in our planning, you remember Bezmenov?
Oh yes.
Yeah, Yuri Bezmenov, who admitted, right? He was a KGB defector. And he said that part of their plan was to infiltrate the American education system, and that it will only take a generation for them to get their people in there, and then to demoralize a whole generation. And that's exactly what they've done. It's interesting. I was listening to an interview. Do you guys know Michael Anton?
I've heard of him. I don't think I've seen any of his stuff though.
But so he did an interview where he talked about a lot of time the people make the historical comparisons with like where the United States is right now and how it's the fall of Rome, and it's a very much overused historical comparison. And he wrote, it was a fairly long essay, but a good read. It didn't take too long to read it, going through the many ways in which the United States right now is in a very different situation, right? And he talked about how like a lot of people, I think even people on the left would say America's kind of on a decline right now, but very rare is it that you've had a civilization that was declining and you had the ruling class celebrating their own decline, right? I don't think you would have found a lot of people in Rome who were celebrating the fall of Rome. I don't think you would have found a lot of people of the ruling regime, and I don't think the Nazis were really celebrating as the as Berlin was being, especially by the Soviets. When they found, I think the Nazis, when they found out that the Americans were letting the Soviets take over Berlin, they were really not in a good mood. That's what actually probably one of the downfalls of the American army in World War II was that we let the Soviets do that. Because Berlin would have been in much better. The people in Berlin would have been in much better shape had the Americans gone through.
That's an interesting point.
I forgot where I'm going with that. But yeah, all right. But anyway, the education, right? So the education system, and I believe it was I was listening to another interview with Dr. James Lindsay, who said that by the 1980s, most education departments, like the big teacher schools in the country, were basically occupied by Marxist sympathetic people and instructors. And the issue with that then becomes, right, so you have people who go to school to become teachers. They're being taught by people who are Marxist or Marxist sympathetic, whatever you want to say, and then they go out and they teach the next generation of students. Well, they've been informed by progressive instructors at an impressionable age, and then they just go create a whole nother generation of people hearing these progressive mantras their whole educational careers.
Yeah, and another counter to this, very important one, I think this will serve as our call to action for today, which we normally do on American Redemption, is give yourself a liberal education. We have all these tools with the internet that allow you to get a better education than you could get in college if you are diligent. Podcasts, YouTube, books, there's so much incredible content out there. Podcasts and YouTube videos on history, philosophy, whatever you can think of that are at the quality of a college lecture. Like Tom's podcast, history lectures that are just like a lecture in college. And a lot of good stuff out there about philosophy and so many good books. I was hoping, Tom, you could give us some recommendations on a basic framework of giving ourselves a liberal education.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I did put this together.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so I put together a little reading list here, just like a very basic, Western canon primer reading list. So first of all, you certainly need to read Homer. So you need to read at the very least the Odyssey, if not also the Iliad. And then to go off that, I understand Virgil kind of copies him, but the Aeneid is also, as far as I'm concerned, required reading. The Aeneid is. Then as well as you kind of go through history kind of chronologically, especially because I know there's a good Catholic audience here. The Didache is a very short book, comes from the 1st century, and you would be surprised. I mean, many things in the Didache that have you can see have been Catholic teaching all the way. I mean, the Didache talks about abortion.
Wow.
And that's in the first century. And so you can see that there are certain things that the church has been saying the entire time. I have a copy of it over there. I should have pulled it over here. I won't interrupt and go like rummaging for it. But it's not very long. It'll take you. You could read it in one sitting. But for a Christian audience, and especially a Catholic audience, take the time to read the Didache, because you'll see how many of the church's teachings have just been consistent since the very beginning. Moving forward, Augustine's City of God and the Confessions, Augustine being one of the great theologians in Catholic history, but at his point in time was the greatest until you get to Aquinas. I would also recommend. I did a video on this, but Saint John Damascus wrote a defense of the holy images, or divine images, I think is the title. Because there's a period of time in the Byzantine Empire Eastern Christianity, because the thing was, St. John Damascus never actually lived under Byzantine control. He only lived under Arab Muslim rule. But he grew up as a government bureaucrat for the Arabs, because the Arabs used a lot of Greek guys to run their government, because they basically kept the same political structures around, and it was the Greek-speaking guys who knew how to run it. But St. John Damascus left bureaucratic work to go be a monk. And so there's a time in Eastern Christianity where people were doing what was called iconoclasm, or icon smashing. If you know anything about Eastern Christianity, right, the iconography, the painted images are a big deal. And so St. John Damascus wrote a defense of the icons, basically. I think it's actually very useful for Catholics today, because when you might get in an argument with a Protestant about why you shouldn't have statues, why you shouldn't have paintings of Jesus, Mary, and the saints, and all that, you get a good defense of it from St. John Damascus. And then as well, you also have Aquinas is obviously required reading, Dante's Divine Comedy. I threw in Don Quixote if you have the time, but I believe that's something like 1,500 pages. So if you don't have the time to slog your way through Don Quixote, I won't fault you for that. Chesterton's Orthodoxy is a classic. Chesterton is so great with quips and one-liners. I remember I tried to read Orthodoxy in high school and just had no idea what he was talking about. And then I think I tried to read it again in undergraduate, and I thought I started understanding a little more. And then I read it fully when I was in graduate school, and it finally clicked. So I would also say, don't feel bad if Chesterton is over your head the first time you read it. He is pretty up there intellectually, but once you get him, he's pretty simple to read, actually. And then to go a little Eastern, I would also recommend Crime and Punishment. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Some people consider him to be the greatest novelist ever. And Crime and Punishment, certainly. I think you find what's interesting. I find with a guy like Dostoevsky is he's writing about issues that we see even a lot of today, and it really just goes to show that human nature doesn't change. It's something I tell kids all the time when I teach history, is that you look at people even from, I taught sixth grade history a couple last year, and there's a little blurb in the ancient Mesopotamia section of the book, and it was a quote from a parent, a note that a parent wrote to his son going to school, and it was go to school, respect your teacher. When school's over, come right home. Don't mess around in the streets, and make sure you do your homework. And I'm like, that's the exact same note that a parent would write their kid today, 5,000 years later, right? I'm like, it's some things just don't change, guys. And I think you certainly see that with Dostoevsky. And then just to wrap it up, and I also recommend everybody read The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And that's another one where it's a 3-volume, 1,500, 2,000 pages. So I would say get the abridged version to start. There's abridged versions that are 300 to 500 pages that I think are perfectly suitable. And then maybe you can graduate and try to slog your way through the 3 volumes of Solzhenitsyn. But it's all the fact that we are not teaching that in schools, because everyone learns in schools that the Nazis were bad. But the Soviets, my goodness, the things the Soviets did were just out of this world. Take what the Nazis did and just multiply it by, I don't even know what. But that's my recommended reading list
That's good.
in,
Thank you
in a
very much.
basic Western canon.
I will definitely put some of those under my list, and I'll add that in the description for everyone too, so they can.
Yeah, I can send that to you as well.
Perfect. Any final thoughts, guys? No,
I think I've spoken my piece.
Good.
No, it was great having you on, Tom. I'm gonna have to get reading.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your show, guys. I really appreciate it.
Likewise. Yeah, this was a good conversation. We'll have to do it again sometime. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Yeah, and we'll see you next time. Make sure you check out both our podcasts if you're coming from the other.
Yeah, and we'll both. I'll link Andrew and Steven's show in my description, and then I'm sure you guys will link mine as well.
Absolutely.
Do the same.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's good. All right, nice. Bye, everyone. Thanks for listening.